Peter. In fact, I've got it in front of me. It's Centre for Independent Studies Analysis, paper 36, April 2022. And in that paper, I mean, it's frank and fearless for sure. Given, I mean, you're someone who used to work at the bank, and you've probably still got a lot of friends there at the bank. But you mention, or you talk about their poor communication and poor process.
Yes.
Now, I mean, you're talking about that before. What do they need to do better? How do we improve it? And I mean, I'm guessing this would be one of your hopes for what the review recommends, but like, how do we improve the process and the communication?
So on this particular, let's start with this particular issue. The bank needs to fully explain itself, that it needs to outline the pros and cons of its arguments and address obvious counter arguments. And preferably, if something is important, you need to say what's the evidence, both consistent with the bank's position, and how do we address evidence that people think weakens the position, and some kind of quantification of these effects is, well, I mean, some of these things can be measured, and there is substantial research on aspects of this question, and that really needs to be discussed and its relevance to policy explained. So that's dealing with one specific area. And why that's important is, unless you do that, mistakes will happen. And so regardless of your position on this particular question of indebtedness, the process was clearly flawed. That if you keep making big decisions that put hundreds of thousands of people out of work without a full, open public discussion, sometimes you're going to make mistakes. And, and when you do make mistakes, they will persist. And open discussion is the best antidote to making serious mistakes, because this was not just a one-off. The bank has a record of very controversial decisions that run counter to mainstream economics. For example, Warwick McKibben, we mentioned earlier, was pushed out of the bank when he objected to its policy. This is back in the late 80s, early 90s, of targeting the current account deficit. So the bank had interest rates far too high because it was worried about the current account deficit. Warwick McKibben said that that was wrong, and it essentially was told he wasn't welcome.
Yeah.
And he left for academia. So this is a cultural problem within the bank. It's resistance to criticism and to scrutiny, even internal scrutiny.
Peter, can I just ask, what are they doing now? So at the moment, they do publish, there's a monetary policy decision every month regarding what they do with the cash rate. There's a page or so of, discussion of where the economy's at, and some sort of, they make clear what their decision is. You'd like to think there's some logical connection with their analysis of the economy and that decision. And the governor does make himself available. He gives speeches. He appears at, parliamentary committees from time to time. So what more needs to be done? And are there any examples around the world of how it's done better?
Yeah, I think most central banks are clearer and more transparent than the RBA. Where it matters most is in reasons for a decision. So where transparency, I think, is most necessary is for the bank to say why it made a decision and why its choice was preferable to alternatives. So, for example, at the moment, okay, the bank will be rising rates. The market expects it to be going up about 50 basis points a month for the next few months. It would be very useful. Well, in fact, I think it's necessary for the bank to say what would be the consequences of alternative choices. Suppose interest rates were to rise slower and interest rates could rise higher. And what would be the unemployment and inflation consequences of those alternatives? My guess is that a faster path of increases would give us lower inflation and higher unemployment. In both cases, bringing those variables closer to the bank's targets. So why is that not the preferred choice? That strikes me as the central requirement for transparency, that explaining why you're not doing something different. And the bank doesn't really do that. It certainly doesn't quantify it, but other central banks do. And that the Federal Reserve, the Riksbank, prominent examples. All it takes is just a little 4-panel chart to show, okay, this is the Goldilocks path in the middle, and this is too high, and this is too low. And these are the consequences, and we pick the path, the Goldilocks path, with the best outcomes. Other central banks do that as a matter of routine. So should the RBA.
Right. So you're talking about Federal Reserve and the Bank of England?
Yeah.
Okay.